When I was a kid, I had this eerie memory of being home alone. For years, I thought it was just a dream, because everything about it felt hazy and unreal. But recently, my mom brought it up, and when I said, "Wait, that actually happened," she said, "Yeah." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a dream. It was real. And honestly, I wish it wasn't. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. Everything felt still and heavy. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you're alone, even if you can't explain how. I was about 4 years old, so the emptiness of the house scared me. I wandered out of my room and into my parents' bedroom. I couldn't reach any light switches, so I moved through the dim glow of moonlight. Their bed was empty. I went downstairs, hoping to find them. The TV was on, showing nothing but static. I don't know what time it was or why it was playing that, but I can still hear that buzzing sound in my head. And there was this strange red flicker, like light from somewhere outside, glowing across the walls. Then I walked into the kitchen. At first, I didn't see her. There was an old woman sitting at the table in the dark. When she spoke, I jumped. I climbed onto a stool to reach the light switch, but she told me not to turn it on. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. I could just make out her shape in the moonlight. And I swear, she was completely naked. For some reason, that didn't scare me at the time. I just accepted it. She said she was our neighbor, and that my parents had sent her to watch over me. She told me they had to go somewhere, but that she'd always be there for me. Before I could respond, I heard the front door unlocking. My parents came rushing in, flipping on the lights. My mom grabbed me, hugging me tight, apologizing for leaving me alone. I told them it was okay, because the neighbor lady had been keeping me company, and that she said she'd always be here. My parents looked confused. When they asked where she was, I pointed to the kitchen. My dad turned on the light. The chair was tipped over, and the back door was wide open. When my mom mentioned this story again recently, she filled in a few missing pieces. Apparently, she and my dad had stepped outside because there was a fire down the street. The red glow I remembered was from the fire trucks and paramedics. She said they were only gone about 5 minutes. But here's the part that gave me chills. My mom said that, according to me back then, the woman wasn't there to take care of me. She was trying to take me away. I told them she was naked and slimmy, a word I couldn't really explain. Mom said they found a jar on the kitchen table with a clear, sticky substance on it. That detail matched what I'd described as slime, even though I have no memory of that part myself. Mom still wonders if the fire and the old woman were somehow connected. Maybe whatever covered her was some kind of accelerant. I don't know. What I do know is that it's unsettling to realize the memory was real. It's not just a creepy childhood dream anymore. It's something that actually happened. And even now, in my 30s, being home alone sometimes makes me feel like that little kid again, standing in the dark kitchen with her. Story 2. I've got a story that's become something of a legend in my family. It's strange because even though it terrified me at the time, I still look back on it fondly. You'll see why in a minute. When I was a kid, my dad worked as a park ranger near Beacon Rock. My parents split up soon after I was born, and things were always a little tense between us. It wasn't that Dad didn't care. He just wasn't made for family life. He loved the outdoors more than anything, and needed to be out in nature to feel like himself. When I was younger, I resented that. But as I got older, I began to understand him, especially after he passed. Dad moved around a lot, bouncing between parks, but once I turned 10, He'd finally settled into a small cabin near Beacon Rock. It was the first time he had a place I could actually visit. That summer was one of the best of my childhood. We went hiking, fishing, exploring. You name it. I thought he was the coolest person in the world. Like most kids hanging around the woods, I was obsessed with Bigfoot stories. Every time we were outside, I'd beg Dad to tell me about the local legends. He'd humor me, even though he preferred talking about actual animals. But I was hooked on the idea of the big hairy creature that supposedly roamed the mountains. One evening, Dad got a call about a search and rescue mission. Someone had gone missing in the park, and all available rangers were needed. He wasn't thrilled about leaving me alone, especially since we'd planned a movie night. But he sat me down and explained how his job sometimes meant saving lives. I told him it was okay, and that I'd keep busy with video games until he got back. After he left, I played Wii Sports until I was worn out, then switched to Zelda. The sun had gone down, and the cabin was quiet. I remember thinking about the lost hiker, and hoping Dad would be okay. That's when I heard it. The sound of creaking footsteps on the porch. I thought maybe Dad had come back early, but then the doorknob rattled. He had a key, so whoever it wasn't him. My heart started pounding. I crept toward the door, trying to peek through the window. Just as I got close, the rattling stopped, and that's when I caught a scent, strong, musky, and damp, like a wet dog. My mind jumped straight to Bigfoot. As I stood there frozen, something tapped lightly on the door. 3 slow knocks, almost like a greeting. Before I could process that, a sharp crack echoed from the back of the cabin. Wood splintering. Someone was trying to break in through the window. I bolted down the hallway and peeked into the back room. A man was outside, trying to pry open the window with some kind of tool. I gasped, and he heard me. Instead of stopping, he tried harder. Without thinking, I shouted for help. From the front of the cabin came a deep, guttural roar, so loud it rattled my chest. Heavy footsteps thundered toward us. The man at the window froze, then scrambled back into the darkness. I ran to the window and saw a massive shadow tearing through the trees after him. It was too big to be human. I locked the window as best I could and hid under the table in the living room. I must have stayed there for hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. The cabin was quiet, but that musky, wet, dog smell filled the air. Oddly enough, instead of being scared, I felt safe. Like whatever had chased the intruder off was still there, keeping watch. I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, Dad was just coming through the door. He looked tired but stopped when he saw me crawling out from under the table. He was holding something. A rock with a feather tucked underneath it. He said he found it sitting neatly on the doorstep when he got back, and it definitely hadn't been there before. I told him everything that had happened, and we just sat there for a while, staring at the strange little offering outside. Later, I learned what had happened that night while Dad was gone. The search and rescue turned out to be a fight between 2 hikers. One pushed the other off a small cliff and ran into the forest. The rangers had to find both men. Dad and I always believed the guy who tried to break in was that same man. The attacker, desperate for shelter. He probably assumed the ranger's cabin was empty. But as for what, or who chased him off, that's another story. We'll never know for sure. The man was never caught, and the only clues left behind were the smell in the air, and that rock and feather on the doorstep. Some people say it must have been a wild animal that scared him away. But I know what I believe. I heard the roar. I smelled it. And that night, something out there decided to protect me. Bigfoot or not, it was real enough for me. Story 3. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time in foster care. Being home alone wasn't unusual for me, but there's one night that still stands out. It started off like any other evening, but ended up changing my life. Looking back, it turned out to be for the better. But at the time, I really thought something terrible was going to happen. Before I tell this, I just want to say one thing. If you're ever thinking about fostering a child, please do it for the right reasons. There are so many kids in the system whose stories don't end as well as mine. I wish that wasn't true. At the time, I'd been with a new family, the Harrisons, for about 3 weeks. I'd just come from a group home, so I was excited to have a real home again. But it didn't take long to realize the Harrisons didn't care about me at all. They weren't abusive, just neglectful. I was basically a way to collect a government check. They were polite enough on the surface. They let me have snacks, watch TV, and keep to myself. I was a shy 6-year-old who preferred reading under my bed to playing outside, so I was probably their ideal foster kid. Quiet and low maintenance. Within a few days, they started leaving me home alone most nights. I didn't really mind. I was used to fending for myself, and actually liked having the place to myself. Every time they went out, Mr. Harrison would remind me of the same 3 rules. Don't break anything, don't answer the door, and brush your teeth before bed. Simple enough. Then one night, while I was watching TV, someone knocked on the door. It startled me because no one had ever come by when I was alone. The house was in a run-down neighborhood. Not terrible, but not great either. Still, I thought it must be safe since my foster parents left me there so often. I knew better than to open the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept into the hallway, staying out of sight from the porch. But whoever was outside must have heard me move, because a man's voice called out, friendly and calm. He said he was from CPS and wanted to check on me. My heart dropped. If CPS found out the Harrisons left me alone, I'd lose this home. And as bad as it was, I didn't want to go back to the group home. So, I stayed quiet. The man kept talking, saying he knew I was there, and that it was okay to open the door. Then, he said he'd been to the house before, and had left something behind. He used the Harrisons' full names, and said they'd told him to come by. That part made me hesitate. When I asked him to repeat who he was, his story changed. He said he was a friend of the family, and that the Harrisons had asked him to check on me. That's when I knew he was lying. Even as a little kid, I could tell something wasn't right. I told him I couldn't open the door, because I wasn't supposed to let strangers in. At first, he praised me for listening, saying I was a good girl. Then he said that was the test, and now that I'd passed, I could unlock the door so he could grab his wallet. I told him no. And that's when everything changed. He exploded with anger, pounding on the door and screaming awful things. I won't even repeat. I remember every sound. The thud of his fists, the insults, the rage. Terrified, I ran upstairs and hid in the closet in my room. From there, I could still hear him trying to break in. The banging, the lock rattling. It went on forever. I was shaking, crying, praying he wouldn't get inside. Eventually, I heard more voices. 2, maybe 3. I thought it sounded like the Harrisons yelling at him. Then there were crashes, something hitting wood, and suddenly, everything went quiet. After a few seconds, I heard the front door slam, and Mrs. Harrison calling my name. I didn't answer right away. I was too scared. They called for me again, sounding more irritated than concerned. Mr. Harrison eventually found me in the closet and told me everything was fine now. I didn't ask questions, and they didn't explain. He seemed annoyed with me, like I'd caused a problem. The next morning, he was gone. Mrs. Harrison made me breakfast like nothing had happened. A few hours later, there was another knock. This time, it really was my caseworker from CPS. She said I was being moved back to the group home. No reason given. Mrs. Harrison wouldn't even look me in the eye when she said goodbye. On the drive back, I told my caseworker about the man at the door. She just said softly, "I know, sweetheart," and patted my head. I never found out who that man was, or how CPS even learned about what happened. I never saw the Harrisons again. Years later, I tried searching for them online, but it was like they'd disappeared. I spent a few more months in the group home before being fostered by a new family. One that eventually adopted me and became my real family. I was lucky. A lot of kids aren't. Some never make it out of situations like that. Even now, a small part of me wonders who that man was and what he wanted. But the bigger part of me knows exactly what kind of person he was. And I'm just thankful I'll never have to find out. Story 4. Grandma was my mom's mom, and there were 4 of us cousins on her side, though 6 in total. Every summer, a few of us would take turns staying with Grandma, and it became something I always looked forward to. Depending on what each family had going on, sometimes it was all of us together, and sometimes just 1 or 2. That particular summer, there was supposed to be a week when my cousins Saffron and Bryant stayed with me. But due to a mix-up with their parents' vacation plans, they were coming a few days later. So, I ended up spending 5 days alone with Grandma. I didn't mind. It was still fun being there, even by myself. One evening, Grandma was heading out to her weekly bingo night. Usually, she didn't like leaving me alone, but I insisted it was fine. I was 12 now, practically grown, and planned to just play on my Nintendo DS or watch TV. She'd only be gone for a few hours. What could possibly go wrong? Turns out, a lot. Grandma had been gone maybe half an hour when the doorbell rang. I figured she'd forgotten her keys and ran to open the door without thinking. But instead of Grandma, there was a young woman standing there. Before I could even react, she smiled, stepped inside, gave me a quick hug, and closed the door behind her. I froze, realizing I wasn't supposed to open the door to strangers. But she seemed familiar somehow. She acted playful, pretending to be hurt that I didn't recognize her. Then she told me she was Alice, Uncle Jim's daughter, my cousin Martin's sister. And it clicked. I vaguely remembered Alice from when I was younger, though I hadn't seen her in years. She looked older now, probably 18 or 19, and kind of edgy, but it definitely seemed like her. There were even photos of her on Grandma's wall. Alice threw her duffel bag on the couch and looked around, asking about Grandma. When I told her Grandma was out at bingo, she said she'd just stay the night and catch her later. Nothing about that felt strange. She was family after all. We talked for a while. She asked about my mom and seemed surprised to learn my parents had divorced. She apologized, said she must have forgotten, and I didn't think much of it. After about an hour, she asked if I remembered playing hide and seek in Grandma's house when we were kids. I kind of did. Then she mentioned how she used to hide in the basement, and none of us could ever find her. I didn't remember that at all, but she laughed, saying all of us cousins were terrified of that basement back. Then, she even said I used to cry when the door was left open. Then she dared me $10 if I went down there to prove I wasn't scared anymore. Now, yeah, in hindsight, it sounds ridiculous, but I was 12 and had no reason to doubt her. She was my cousin, and I wanted that $10. Grandma's basement wasn't scary. It was just for storage. So I went. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind me. I heard a key turn in the lock. At first, I thought she was joking. I shouted for her to let me out. I pounded on the door. An hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. My voice was raw from yelling, and I was crying harder than I'd ever cried in my life. I kept begging her to open the door, but she never answered. When I finally heard the lock turn again, I ran up the stairs. Grandma was standing there, pale and shaking. I threw my arms around her, sobbing. When I managed to explain what happened, Grandma kept asking if I was sure it was Alice. Our cousin Alice. I told her yes. At least that's who she said she was. Grandma didn't say much after that. She just went to check something, and when she came back, she looked even more shaken. I never found out exactly what Alice took that night, but it must have been something valuable. Later, I learned that she'd been estranged from the family for years, after falling in with a bad crowd. None of the adults had ever told us about it. Apparently, Alice had been watching Grandma's house and knew I'd be alone. Locking me in the basement had given her plenty of time to steal whatever she came for. Years later, Cousin Martin told me something that made my blood run cold. When Grandma came home that night, she found a hammer sitting on the cabinet. One Alice must have brought with her. Martin believes that if she hadn't managed to trap me in the basement, she might have used it on me instead. No one ever heard from Alice again. Grandma passed away a few years ago, and after that, no one in the family spoke her name. She became something of a ghost story among us. Someone we all pretended didn't exist. For me, that night marked the end of my childhood. I stopped looking forward to summer vacations after that. But I guess I was lucky. Being locked in a basement for a few hours was a lot better than what might have happened if she hadn't. Story 5. I was in my late teens when this happened, around 2008. I was still in high school, and my parents were out at a charity event that night, leaving me home alone. Everything was fine at first. Quiet. Uneventful. Until about an hour later when the phone started ringing. The caller ID said, "Blocked number." I don't know why I answered. Maybe I didn't notice, or maybe I was just curious. Either way, I picked up and greeted the caller cheerfully, saying something like, "Hello, this is the my parents' name residence. How can I help you?" That was the start of one of the creepiest nights of my life. The first few calls came from someone using a deep, robotic, sounding voice. The person described what I was wearing, what I was doing, and even which channel I'd switched to on the TV. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. But when it's happening to you, it's not thrilling or dramatic. It's gross. I felt exposed, like someone had ripped away my sense of safety. At first, I screamed at him to leave me alone and hung up. But every time the phone rang again, I still picked up. I know that sounds stupid, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know how he could see me, and how much danger I was really in. While he kept calling, I ran around the house closing blinds, locking doors and double-checking windows. I didn't call the police because he hadn't technically threatened me. He was just describing what I was doing. "You're wearing a white t-shirt. You just changed the channel. You're pouring a glass of water." Completely mundane things. But it was horrifying to know someone could see me do them. Every time, I thought about calling the cops. I convinced myself they wouldn't take it seriously. It was 2008. Cyberstalking and phone harassment weren't things people really talked about yet. So I just kept answering, hoping to figure something out. Eventually, I noticed a pattern. When I went upstairs, he'd stop calling. He could only see me when I was on the first floor. That realization gave me a strange kind of confidence. I thought maybe I could bait him, get more clues. Looking back, that was incredibly dumb. But at the time, I was angry and freaked out, and part of me wanted to take control of the situation. So I stayed downstairs, with every curtain drawn and every blind closed. There was no way anyone could see inside. Yet the calls kept coming. He still described exactly what I was doing. You just got up from the couch. You're drinking water. You're turning off the TV. It didn't make sense, and that's what scared me the most. He didn't say anything threatening or even sexual. Just statements, flat and cold. It was like he didn't know why he was doing it, only that he wanted to. I tried ignoring the calls, but they came nonstop. The phone would ring, stop, and then ring again seconds later. Finally, I lost my temper, answered, and yelled, "How can you see me?" His reply made my blood run cold. "I'm in the house with you," he said in that same robotic voice. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a deadpan, "Ha." I froze. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I knew he couldn't actually be inside. I would have heard him. But the words alone were enough to send me spiraling. I checked closets, corners, everywhere I could think of. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was in there. Then I started thinking more logically. Everything he described happened in the living room or near the kitchen doorway. That particular angle was familiar. The same view you'd see from the webcam on our family's old desktop computer. That's when it hit me. He wasn't outside. He wasn't in the house. He was watching me through our computer's webcam. This was 2008. Back when webcams were these clunky little attachments that sat on top of your monitor. The idea that hackers could spy on you through one was still pretty new. I bolted to the computer, yanked the webcam's plug out of the port, and the phone stopped ringing. Instantly. That confirmed it. Someone had hacked into our computer's webcam. Oddly, I felt a little relieved. A creepy internet stranger felt easier to deal with than the idea of a real person outside my window. But I still felt disgusting, knowing someone had been watching me in my own home. A family friend who knew about computers ran a scan and found that a program had been downloaded about a week earlier. We never figured out who did it, but I'm pretty sure it was my 12-year-old brother. He used to download random games and junk all the time. We reported it to the police, but this was before cybercrime really meant anything. They didn't do much. I also didn't explain how bad it got, or how many times I'd answered the phone. I think I was embarrassed. I'm just thankful that webcam was in the living room and not my bedroom. After that, I put tape over every webcam in the house, and I've done the same ever since. Even now, almost 20 years later, I still do it. And I make sure my kids do too. Because once you've been watched like that, you never forget how it feels. Story 6. So, I'm a girl. And this happened back in the early 2000s, when meeting people online was still seen as risky. And honestly, that was probably a good thing. Because some of the people you'd run into online back then were straight up weird. This started when a guy added me on ICQ. That old instant messenger that let you randomly connect with strangers. You couldn't really tell if someone had found you by typing in your username or if it was just a random match. So, I had a mix of real life friends and random internet people on my list. One of them was a guy we'll call Steve. Steve seemed funny and laid back. We didn't talk much about personal stuff, just sent dumb jokes, memes before they were even called that, and music recommendations from Napster or LimeWire. He was one of those mysterious online friends you never really think too deeply about. Then one night, when I was home alone, my parents were out of town. Steve sent me a message that made my stomach drop. He said, "Hey, I'm coming over tonight since you're home alone." I froze. I had never told him where I lived, and I definitely hadn't mentioned that my parents were gone. I figured it had to be a joke, so I replied with something like, "All sure," expecting him to admit he was kidding. But he didn't. He said he was serious. I scrolled back through our old messages to see if I'd accidentally mentioned being alone. I hadn't. When I asked him how he knew, he said something that made my skin crawl, that he actually went to my high school. He said he'd been wanting to tell me, but hadn't known how. I thought he was still joking until he started mentioning specific details about me and my school. At that point, I wasn't laughing anymore. I asked who he was, but he said he didn't want to tell me unless he could explain in person. That he had feelings for me and didn't want me to freak out if I found out who he really was online. That's when I started to get angry. It felt manipulative and creepy. The whole "I know you're alone" thing made it worse. I started to think maybe this wasn't some harmless online guy. Maybe it was someone from school. And the only person who fit that description was this skater kid named Andy. He'd had a crush on me a few years before and had been a little too pushy about it until I told him to stop. So, I convinced myself that Steve was Andy and that he was just trying to mess with me. I told him to drop it, blocked him, and figured that was the end of it. About 15 minutes later, my doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be a delivery or something, but then it hit me. What if it really was him? My stomach twisted. I crept toward the front door, and through the frosted glass, I could see that no one was standing there. But when I looked out the peephole, I saw something spray painted across the driveway. That's when I knew Steve really was someone local. I felt sick. I scrubbed the graffiti off before my parents came home, because I didn't want them blaming me for talking to strangers online. I just wanted the whole thing to disappear. That Monday, I confronted Andy at school, with a couple of friends by my side, and demanded to know where he'd been that night. His whole group of friends immediately said, "Skate park," and apparently, he'd been in some late night skating contest that Friday. Everyone there saw him pull off some big trick, so he had an airtight alibi. It wasn't Andy. Later that day, Andy caught up with me and asked what was really going on. I told him that some guy online had threatened me and acted like he knew me. To his credit, he took it seriously and said he'd ask around to see if anyone knew anything. But no one ever found out who Steve was. Years later, though, I started piecing things together, and I'm almost certain it was my history teacher. He was one of those younger teachers in his late 20s, the kind who tried to be cool with students. We used to talk a lot about music and movies, and I had a bit of a crush on him, like a lot of girls did. But after I blocked Steve, that teacher suddenly changed toward me. Cold, distant, even snapping at me in class for no reason. It was the only person whose behavior shifted overnight. It's horrifying to think about now, that a grown man, a teacher, could have been talking to me online under a fake name, and then, when I rejected him, vandalized my driveway. I could never prove it, and by the time I put it all together, I was graduating and moving on. I just hope whoever he was never crossed the line again with anyone else.